It's a pleasure to have Professor Glewwe today with us. Paul Glewwe is Professor of Applied Econometrics at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches econometrics and microeconomic analysis of development. His research focuses on education in developing countries, especially the factors that determine academic outcomes in primary and secondary school. He also conducts research on malnutrition, inequality, and poverty. And he has conducted research on numerous developing countries, such as Brazil, Ghana, Honduras, Jamaica, etc., including Peru, too. And he has authored or edited 4 books on these topics and has published over 50 articles in academic journals, over 25 chapters in academic books. So it's really an honor to have Professor Glewwe today with us. And today's talk is titled, The Impact of School Characteristics and Pedagogy, Governance, and Demand-Sided Education Policies on Learning and Time in School in Developing Countries. So please welcome Professor Paul Glewwe, and well, the floor is all yours. Thank you, Paul.
So what we did is we were asked to basically review what we know about education in developing countries in terms of, what makes kids stay in school or go to school or not drop out, and also how much do they learn when they're in school. And that's why the reason this have this very long title here is that we look at 4 different kinds of policies. I guess I pushed the laser pointer. Anyways, the 4 policies are sort of demand policies. Actually, I think we changed the name. Okay, but we'll get to that. Okay, so let's go on here and just go to the topic. Okay, on the talk. So I think you all know that education is really important for economic development, and developing countries spend a lot of money on education, and we estimate about $1 trillion per year. This is all developing countries all around the world. And actually, parents also spend a lot in addition to that because they buy their kids all kinds of things, uniforms, textbooks, tutoring, and all kinds of things. We don't have a good estimate of that, but we're pretty sure it's many hundreds of millions of dollars. So a lot of the money is being spent. And in some ways, this is working because there have been large increases in enrollment in the past 25 years, and I'll show you some numbers there. But the bad news is that a lot of kids are going to school, but they're not learning very much. So that's kind of the big issue. And there are also some places where there's still some lack of enrollment in some countries. Okay. The other good news, other than that the kids are going to school, is that there's a lot of evidence that has come out in the last 10 years or so about what's going on. And since the last chapter, the focus on this was 10 years ago, it was time to do an updated version of the chapter. So that's basically what this is. So here's some numbers here on primary and secondary enrollment. Look in 1960. So I guess just to for some reason the laser sometimes works, but you can see that by 2010 the enrollment rates in developing countries were very 100% or more. And you might say, well, how can you be more than 100%? Well, it has to do with repetition and things like that. Okay, the more important one is the third column there, which is about completion rate, which is how many kids actually complete primary school. And in all of these regions of the world, except sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit South Asia, almost every kid is finishing primary school, which wasn't the case before. Actually, we don't even know back in 1960 how many kids were finishing, but if you look at the numbers there, a lot of them were not in school at all. And on the secondary level, I'll explain the residuals a little bit later. Okay, on the secondary level in these 2 columns here, back in 1960, even the OECD countries, like Japan and Europe and the US and Canada and Australia, only 52% of kids were enrolled. But now 100% in those countries and well into these, and if you look at Latin America, 85% gross enrollment rates, which is quite high. Okay, so the lesson from this slide is that kids are going to school, and the main task at hand is to see that they're learning while they're in school. Okay, so here's some graphs that, well, this one is not so interesting because it's completely flat. It's basically showing that no matter what income level is, so the bottom there is GDP per capita in 2010, and the left-hand side is enrollment rates. Basically, all the countries for the primary, the gross enrollment rates, they're almost all at 100%. There's a few outliers there, Eritrea and Djibouti, and can't even remember which one that one is. Their kids are all going to school. However, you look at completion rates, there is variation here. The poor countries, not everyone is finishing school, where the richer countries, almost everybody's at 100%, okay? And that line there is just a fitted line from ordinary least squares. And in fact, if you look at that fitted line, the red line there, you can sort of say that, well, there are countries on both sides of the line, developed and developing countries. So if you go back to the chart here, this residual here is sort of in terms of how are countries doing in terms of, how are they doing in terms of the being on the line, okay? And so actually the OECD countries in terms of a simple line, they're a little bit worse than average. You can't go above 100%, okay? So even if your income is really high, so they look bad. The developing countries on the whole tend to be on average a little bit above the line, including Latin America and the Caribbean, the one exception being sub-Saharan Africa. So if you sort of say, well, look, it's kind of unfair to hold these developing countries to try to get 100% because they have a lot lower incomes. So the whole point of these residuals is to sort of say that conditional on income, developing countries are not doing too bad in terms of getting kids to finish primary, except for sub-Saharan Africa. And then secondary enrollment, the same kind of point here, is that conditional on income, they're not doing too bad in terms of getting kids in enrollment. Again, but sub-Saharan Africa is one exception here. Okay, so let me show you another slide. This is secondary enrollment, gross enrollment rates. Here there's, again, higher income countries have higher enrollment rates, but in most regions of the world, the exception being sub-Saharan Africa, they're close to 100%. So we're getting kids into school, but what are they learning? And this can be a sore point. How many here are familiar with the PISA comparison of countries in mathematics and reading? Raise your hand. Okay, so most of you. And you know that Peru is one of the countries, right? Where is Peru on this map, actually? Right there, okay? Not very high. But on the other hand, given its income level, it's not terrible, okay? You might say, look at this, Luxembourg's not very high. Luxembourg is below the line, too, okay? But if you just look at the vertical axis there, yeah, Peru didn't do very well, and these other ones in terms of the math scores of kids at age 15. Let me just point out one outlier. This is Vietnam. Vietnam actually did very well, and I do some research on Vietnam, and we're actually going to check whether that's really true. I mean, it's almost too good to be true. And I guess Qatar is almost too bad to be true on the right there. So anyways, you might say Peru did really horrible in this list, but actually compared to its income level, it's below average, but not really off like Qatar is or something like that. So that's math scores in 2015. But I guess the bottom line is that kids are getting through school, but in many countries they're not learning very much. And so a lot of what we want to do in this review chapter is try to understand, well, what could they be doing? What can they do to make it better? Okay, so this is reading scores. That was math scores. Again, not doing too well. Peru's kind of in the same thing, a little below average, but so is some of these, Switzerland and Luxembourg are below the line too. And again, Vietnam is way up there, and what are they doing? It's so great. Okay, and then if you look at grade 4 scores, I don't know if Peru was actually in this one. Yeah, this is from the TIMSS, which is a different study. I'm not sure if Peru was in that one or not. But again, there's a very high relationship between the income of the country and how well they do. Okay. Okay, so that kind of gives you a background as to where we are. Let's see, which is this one? Oh, this is grade 8 in the TIMSS. Yeah, kind of the same thing. Okay, so let's kind of go on and look at some other things. Another way of thinking about, well, these developing countries maybe are not doing too bad, is that from a historical perspective, they, given their income level, they're actually doing better than the developed countries were doing when they had the same income, 100, 200 years ago. So just to take an example here, Peru is a middle income country, so right there is kind of, in the year 2010, the average middle income country. These are in purchasing power parity adjusted numbers, that's where they were. So 2010, they had, enrollment rate of 69% and, pretty much over 100% enrollment. But what about when the developed countries were back then? I mean, the US back in 1900 had a similar level of income. It had much lower rates of school enrollment. And if you go to the UK back in 1890, look, 1% of the kids in the UK at that income level were in secondary school. So in some sense, conditional on income, things are going better, but still it's not great. But the thing to really worry about is those test scores. So what we're going to do in this, so what we did in this paper is we looked at we looked through the education literature and the economics literature. So the economics literature, there's a search engine, EconLit. For the education, there's something called ERIC. We look for any paper published between 1990 and 2014 that had to do with developing countries in education, okay? And we came up with a lot of them, okay? 13,000. We weren't going to read all of those, okay? But we did look at the abstracts and tried to focus, because some of them, they're on education, but, for example, an economics paper would be on what's the effect of education on wages. Well, that's not what we're looking at. We're trying to figure out what's the effect of school policies, education policies, and how much kids learn and how far they go in school. So when we kind of went through all these papers and looked at the abstracts, there were only about 1,000. Well, that's still a very large number. From the year 1990 to 2014, that looked at what's the effect of school characteristics, teacher characteristics, education policies on learning and on this, okay? Well, we had to go through those more carefully, not just looking at the abstracts, but at the full papers, which turns out that there were some. So then we were down to 320. That's still a lot of papers. And then the last thing we did, and this is what some people might not like, was that we sort of established what we think are high-quality papers. High-quality papers, there were basically three kinds. Randomized controlled trials. That's this RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Regression discontinuity design. I'm not sure how much you've had that in your econometrics class. And difference in differences. Those are the three methods we think are high-quality papers, and so then instead of having 320, we're down to 118, but that's still a lot. And then finally, of these, most of them, 80, were randomized controlled trials, okay, which we think is the best method, okay. You may have heard that other people like Angus Deaton, who just won the Nobel Prize like 3 weeks ago, doesn't think maybe they're the best method, but we can get into the details later because we're going to have question and answer period. Okay, so we're focusing, everything I'm going to show you is focusing on these studies, okay, that we think are high quality, that look at what's the effect of education policies on child learning or child enrollment in school. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the results. We basically divided up the policies into three types. Demand side policies, that's basically making school more attractive, like reducing the tuition, conditional cash transfers, things like that. Input policies, this is sort of traditional things, have more teachers, have more textbooks, have a nicer school and things like that. Pedagogy policies, this is sort of how teachers teach. What are they, what methods are they using? What kind of ways they try to get the kids involved? And finally, governance policies is how are the schools run? What kind of accountability is there? Are teachers is their performance being monitored? Are they being rewarded or maybe not being rewarded? And then there's, private schools and decentralization. There's lots of things that fall under that. So those are the four kinds of policies. And so I'm going to show you now the tables for each of these. By the way, I don't have you tell me when I'm running out of time because I don't see any clock in this. So I'm just kind of going at my own speed. Okay. So tables, so this table, we're looking at the demand side interventions. I'm just putting in this table the ones where we have 2 or more studies. So in the very right-hand side, and all these tables have the same format, the very right-hand side tells you how many studies there are, these high-quality studies, either randomized controlled trials, difference in differences, or regression discontinuity, that looked at these things, okay? And then we say, okay, from those studies, how many estimates were positive significant? In terms of, in this table, it's time in school, like enrollment rates, daily attendance, dropout rates, things like that. So the first one, and this is kind of unusual policy, but we'll start with that one. Information on returns to education. This is basically telling kids that, you know what, if you go to school, if you finish secondary school, your wages are probably going to be higher than if you don't finish secondary school, and this is how much. There are two studies. One is by Robert Jensen of Dominican Republic, and one was done in China by a whole team of Chinese researchers. Okay, so did these things make kids go to school longer? Well, actually, sometimes. Okay, so then there's these two studies for this case. There's the one by Robert Jensen and one by the Chinese researcher team. And there were several estimates. So the numbers here that are not in parentheses, the numbers that are not in parentheses are the number of estimates, because sometimes there's more than one estimate per paper. The numbers that are in parentheses are how many studies those estimates are coming from. So from these two studies, there were a total of 4 estimates, one there, and then 2 more there, so 4 estimates. 2 of them were positive, but they only come from one study, the Jensen study of Dominican Republic. So one of the 2 studies found that, yeah, if you tell kids that, if you stay in school, you'll probably have higher income, they actually stay in school longer. But in China, that didn't happen. It didn't come from the China study. So that's kind of the way it is. And then, so the estimates from the China study over here, they didn't have any significant effect, telling kids that if you go to school more. So that's kind of the way to read these tables. Maybe before I go on, if anybody has any questions about how to read these tables, did I explain it clearly or maybe not so clearly? Okay. All right. So anyways, those 2 studies on just telling kids, and one thing about that policy is it's very inexpensive. You just get the kids to come to a meeting, you tell them, like, here's the average wages of somebody who doesn't finish secondary school. Here's the average wages somebody does. Okay, then you're done, and that was pretty cheap to do. Okay. Here's something not so cheap, conditional cash transfer policies. I don't know that there are one in Peru, but in many Latin America, there are in Peru? Okay. So in many Latin American countries, there are, starting in Mexico and Brazil, and then Central American countries and Colombia, there's a lot of these. We have a total of 20 studies. Of these 20 studies, 13 are randomized controlled trials, first one being in Mexico, and then 7 are other high-quality studies, either difference in differences or regression discontinuity. Well, and you probably know what these are. You tell the parents or the kids that, look, if you're enrolled in school at this level of schooling, and some are primary level, some are secondary level, and you have an attendance rate of like 80% or 85% in the past month, we'll give you a monthly payment, okay? Does that make people stay in school? Well, clearly it does. Almost all the estimates, 40 out of 43 are significantly positive. So yeah, if you give kids money to stay in school, or you give their parents money, they do stay in school. It may not be a big effect. So we're not saying, okay, this is what we need to do to get kids in school. And it may be very expensive. These policies tend to be very expensive. But they do work. They get kids to stay in school. Okay. And we have a long discussion in the chapter about all the different ones. And this time in school includes both, daily attendance and how many years of schooling and so forth. Okay. Another one that gets kids to stay in school, well, actually, maybe, eliminating school fees. There was 2 studies. One was from South Africa. The other one was from Ethiopia. The one from Ethiopia had a significant effect, and the one from South Africa did not. But you can kind of see that, yeah, it would make sense that if you reduce school fees, that people would be more likely to come to school. Another interesting one that is kind of unusual, and there's only 2 studies, I think they're both from Kenya, are merit-based scholarships. Here is you basically say, okay, if you do well this year, we're going to pay for 2 more years of your schooling. That was done in Kenya. In Kenya, the primary school goes from grade 1 to grade 8. They took girls who were in grade 6, and they said, look, if you do well this year, the top 15% of girls in a test at the end of the year, we're going to pay for the next 2 years of their schooling. And that worked. They actually, we'll see later that they actually learned more, but also they stayed in school more. So that when they come back 2 years later, a lot of those girls are still in school. In fact, some of the boys it had a positive effect on the boys too. So basically, telling kids we're going to pay for your schooling, or we're telling their parents we're going to pay for your schooling if you do well on an academic test at the end of this year, they actually that made kids stay in schooling. Okay. And then finally, building new schools. These were studies from Ethiopia and Afghanistan. Actually, those were Ethiopia and Afghanistan. And then there was Indonesia and a couple other ones. Yeah, building new schools definitely gets kids to go to school. Okay. Now, in most countries, there's a lot of schools out there already. Okay, so building new schools is maybe not the great idea, but I was just talking to Juan about, in some places in Peru, there are very dispersed populations that may be far from a school. So either building schools or maybe something that's relevant to Peru, or maybe having these boarding schools. Okay, so that's time in school for these kinds of demand-side interventions. What about having kids learn? Because the kind of message of the tables I showed you before was that, okay, we're pretty good at getting kids to go to school, but are they learning anything? So the next table here is these demand-side policies, how they affect how much. The information on returns to schooling, the China study was the only one that looked at that. It didn't really work very well. Yeah, so you tell kids, if you stay in school longer, you'll probably have a higher income, but maybe they didn't actually, in China at least, they weren't learning anything more. Conditional cash transfers, this one is actually a little contentious because you're paying kids to stay in school, you're not paying them to learn more, and the studies kind of vary. For the randomized controlled trials, there are 5 of these. 3 of them found significantly positive effects, but 2 did not. And then for 2 other high-quality studies, neither of them found. So sometimes conditional cash transfers not only leads you to stay in school longer, but you'll actually learn more. Okay. Merit-based scholarships, the estimates are clearer that if you pay kids, you tell them, look, if you do well in school, we're going to pay for additional years of schooling. That actually increased the learning in 3 out of the 4 studies. Okay, so that seemed to work pretty well. And finally, building more schools also worked. You have to keep in mind that the reason it worked for building new schools is that we were comparing communities that got new schools with ones that did not. And we're also looking at kids not just in school, but kids who are not in school. So clearly, if you don't go to school, you're not going to learn as much. And so that's kind of why we see this effect here. But these are demand-side policies, some of them that seem to work. Well, actually, this one didn't work, the informing them about that. But some of these worked. Okay. That's not to say that we necessarily are going to go out and do this tomorrow. Conditional cash transfers are expensive policies. Merit-based scholarships are a little bit controversial because by definition, only kids who get these are the ones who did well on some preliminary exams. So you're excluding a lot of kids from that. Okay. On the other hand, you might say, hey, even though we only gave 15% of girls in Kenya the scholarships, everyone was trying hard to get them, so they all learned more. So maybe that's what we wanted to do. Okay, so that's demand-side interventions. The next one I'm going to look at is input interventions. There are a lot of these, traditional ones, and a lot of the results were kind of surprising. And some of these I know about because I worked on them. Textbooks, you would think giving more kids textbooks, that should make them go to school more and actually learn more. So just jumping ahead in terms of learning. Textbooks, yeah, sorry. So in terms of learning, textbooks also didn't have any effect. But it also didn't make them go to school longer. You might think that's kind of strange. Why did that not happen? Well, these are basically from 2 studies. One was in Kenya and one was from Sierra Leone. And both of them, they kind of screwed it up. Okay, in Kenya, the problem, and I was a co-author on that one, the textbooks were too hard. The kids couldn't read them, so it wasn't a very good thing. Actually, what we learned most from that study was that kids were really falling behind. And by the time they were in 3rd grade, they pretty much, most of them were so far behind that they couldn't read the textbook anymore. But they kept coming to school and not maybe learning very much. So giving them this textbook didn't really help very much. And the Sierra Leone was even worse. They gave out these textbooks, and the teachers and the principals decided that we shouldn't give them all out at once because we're never going to get any more new textbooks. So they kind of mostly kept them in storage and didn't actually hand them out. So that's why there was no effect of that one. School meals, this is also somewhat controversial. Some people, and one guy that told me a lot of this, Harold Alderman at the World Bank, says, yeah, if you give school meals, kids will come to school, but it's not really going to make them learn more. It's not like they're so malnourished that they need a school meal to learn. But he said, yeah, but it will get them to come to school more. But actually we found that it didn't seem to get them Of the 5 studies, only one of them, and I think Harold may have been an author on that one, found that kids actually go to school more when you provide school meals. Mostly there was no effect, okay? A variant of that is take-home rations, where you don't feed them at school, but you say, okay, if you come to school, and this is popular in places like India and Bangladesh, if you come to school, we're going to give you a bag of rice or something that you can take home and feed your family. So there are only 2 studies. One of them found an effect and the other one did not. Okay, and the last one, a very famous study by Michael Kramer and Ted Miguel, found that deworming medicine in an area where there's lots of these parasitic worms got kids to stay in school longer. Okay, so that's sort of school inputs, and these are, you can think of deworming and school meals as sort of like medical or feeding inputs. There aren't very many studies at high quality. There are a lot of what you might call lower quality studies. So in some ways you'd say, I'd like to know more. What about other things you can do at schools, like, you know, have fancy things? We'll get to computers a little bit later, but more traditional inputs, there weren't very many high quality studies. What about learning in terms of test scores from these things? One thing that worked pretty well, it's actually pretty obvious, is that if you have longer school day, this was a study in Ethiopia and can't remember which other country is. Yeah, kids learn more if the school day is longer. Textbooks did not work well. I talked about that before. Actually, this one is a little bit controversial. Negative actually is a good thing here. By negative, for the pupil-teacher ratio, we mean that if the pupil-teacher ratio is high, you learn less. In other words, if we hire more teachers, you will learn more. So we found that of the 3 studies, 2 of them showed that having a high pupil-teacher ratio, having not enough teachers, so to speak, will reduce what kids learn. But one study did not find that. Okay. The reason it's controversial is that in developed countries like the US, people like Eric Hanishek, who's the editor of this book that we wrote the chapter for, would say this is like, doesn't work very well. Although some people like Alan Kruger would dispute that. But the other thing is that it's very expensive. Hiring more teachers is very expensive, so maybe that's not the best way to go. What about school meals? Unlike what Harold Alderman sort of predicted, in 3 out of the 4 studies, so there's 4 studies, 2 of them that were RCTs and one that was another kind of high quality study, they found significant effects of school meals on children's learning. So that was a bit of a surprise, and I'm sure Harold will have some opinion about that. And then finally, there are a couple studies that provide iron supplements, pills, one in China, or maybe both of them are in China. One of them found a significant effect on learning, but the other one didn't. Okay, so we found some things that seem to work here, but they're not necessarily cheap. You know, pupil-teacher ratio is expensive. School meals can be relatively expensive. Okay. Okay, the next thing I want to look at are pedagogy. Unfortunately, we didn't find a whole lot of studies in pedagogy for time in school. And the first one, it might seem like a strange name, teaching at the right level. This kind of goes back to the Kenya study I was telling you about before, where we found out that the kids couldn't read the textbooks, okay? So you might say, okay, what's happening is the teacher will teach from the textbook, and so they're kind of teaching over the heads of these kids at a level that they don't understand. So maybe it would be good to say, okay, let's put those textbooks aside, let's figure out how much these kids know now, and then let's sort of go from there and kind of present the material at the level they can understand. So there's studies in India and Kenya that do this. Actually, most of those studies look at how much kids learn, but one of them, I think it was the India study, found that, yeah, if you teach at the right level, well, actually, it didn't find a significant effect, okay? But we'll see later on for test scores that it actually had a big effect, okay? And the other one was computers and electronic games. These were sort of, we'll have a lot more to show about those in the next slide. They didn't actually get kids to go to school. Actually, most of the studies didn't look at whether they got kids to stay in school. They most looked at test scores, okay? So we don't see anything here in terms of pedagogy that's going to get kids in school. But again, that may not be the big problem. The big issue may be getting these kids to learn something. So the next slide really goes to that. Okay, so for these pedagogy interventions, we have more of them. And we found that teaching at the right level, there's 3 studies. All of them found positive significant effects on learning. So in other words, if you have to make sure that the teachers are teaching at where the kids are in terms of their learning. And it's surprising how in African and in South Asian countries, they often just ignore where the kids are and just teach what's in the textbook or what's in the curriculum. There's one interesting study in Kenya again. And a lot of these studies, are done in Kenya because that's where Michael Kramer got started, and I was doing some of those studies, and a lot in India because that's where Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo are doing stuff. So a lot of this stuff is from Kenya and India. But in the tracking in the study in Kenya, they actually had these schools where they had multiple grades, multiple classrooms in a given grade. And it sort of comes back to this teaching at the right level. If you've got kids in a typical grade there, some of them have learned a lot, some of them haven't learned very much, and so the teacher has to try to teach to a group of students who have very different sort of preparation for the curriculum. So what tracking or streaming does is say, okay, if we've got, say, in grade 3, we've got 2 teachers, why don't we divide the kids up according to their sort of initial level of learning, and so the one teacher will get the kids who are at the lower level, the other teacher will get the kids at the higher level, so at least the teachers can sort of adjust what they're doing to the level of the kids. So in some ways it sounds unfair, like why put all the kids who are in the lower level, together? But they in fact found that this worked pretty well, and that in both kinds of kids, both the ones who started out very low in terms of how much they had learned, and the ones who had already learned a lot, they both improved a lot more compared to leaving them all sort of grouping the kids all in the same classroom with many different abilities. Okay, here's a big one: computers, electronic games, internet connections, and stuff like this. A lot of studies, 9 studies, 8 of them randomized controlled trials. 6 out of the 8, or 6 out of the 9, found significant positive effects on learning. However, there are 2 studies that found significant negative effects on learning. And as you probably know, in Peru there was a big one laptop per child, that didn't work very well. I know it wasn't one of the positive. In fact, I don't remember if it was one of the negative ones. But basically, they gave a lot of nice laptops. Well, maybe they weren't that nice. I'm not really sure. But didn't learn very much. But in other cases, they work. So the lessons from computers is that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And why is that the case? Probably the worst thing you can do is just hand kids computers and not really tell them what to do, or hand them out in classrooms and not really get teachers to use them because they're really not familiar with them. So it doesn't work very well. There's an interesting study in Romania where they gave these kids computers at home, and then they actually followed up and asked the kids, what did you do with the computer? Well, they played a lot of games. In fact, they actually had less time studying homework because they were playing games on the computers. So that was one of the significant negative effects. But if it's done correctly, they can have positive effects. So there's a lot of potential here, but we need to learn more about how to do it, okay? And in Peru is one case where it didn't work very well. And then finally, there's reading intensive pedagogy. This was a special program. I can't remember which country it was from. That seemed to work pretty well. Okay, so the last set of studies I'm going to look at, then I'll wrap it up here, are the governance one. These are ones that are, maybe what we really, the issue is not, we need to give them computers, we need to give them the right textbooks, stuff like that, or we need to have more teachers. Maybe it's we need to organize the whole way the system is run. Okay, so this is time in school. Monitoring has to do with, are the teachers kind of being watched to see if they're doing a good job? Okay. And strictly speaking, these monitoring, there's kind of they are, it's not just watching the teachers, but actually rewarding them if they show up, or rewarding them if they, if they're doing a good job, trying hard and so forth. Well, for time in school, there were only 2 studies and it didn't seem to work. But we'll see later when we look at test scores that there were better effects. School-based management, this is something that's very popular. It's been going on. Some people in the World Bank have been pushing this for many years. This idea that, okay, we should have local authorities decide how things are done. They should pick which textbooks to use. They should hire and fire teachers. They should maybe determine what curriculum they're going to use and so forth, okay? There have been a fair number of studies here. The bottom line is, for the most, as far as getting kids to go to school, they don't really seem to work very well, okay? They didn't really have much of an effect. But the things are a little bit different when you look at test scores. what about, and this is something that most of the studies have been done in Latin America, what if we say, okay, maybe there's something wrong with the public schools, private schools are better, maybe we should just give them money to go to private schools. There was a study in Colombia that did this. I think of what other studies. I think there was something like this in Romania, I can't remember. Anyways, these private school vouchers, in the case of Colombia, it worked. So that's the one, but I can't remember which other country was the other one. It didn't work so well. And there was a third study also didn't work so well. And finally, teacher incentives. This is where basically the teachers get paid money, sort of, or they get some prizes if the kids score well on tests. Okay, this is extremely controversial. It's very, some people are pushing this in the U.S. and other people hate this. They think it's kind of messing the entire teacher-pupil relationship here. Well, to make a long story short, the only study that looked at this was the study in Kenya. Another one I did with Michael Kramer. Didn't find any effect on having kids go to school longer. Okay, but you see later, maybe it has them learn more. So the last table I'm going to show you here is the effect of these governance initiatives on test scores of kids. And here there's a lot more studies, and there's some, reasons at home. One is monitoring. That one actually worked. Okay, and the one that worked, well, only 1 out of 4 worked. So not that. The one that worked is this study by Esther Duflo and Rima Hanna and Steve Ryan, where in India they actually gave cameras to the teacher, and these are cameras that are, they automatically put the date. And so they basically said to the teacher, the problem in this part of India, it was a very remote area, the teachers were only showing up 60% of the days, okay? So what they said is, okay, you with this camera, take a picture of yourself with the kids in the school at the beginning of the school day, at the end of the school day. And we give you, actually, I think it was rolls of film. The rolls of film will stamp these things. Every month you mail in the roll of film. 15 days or something, or maybe 12 days, you have to be there every month. Every day, more than 15 days or more than 12 days that you're there, we're going to give you some money, okay? So if we see this picture of you like 15 days, or let's say that 12 days was the minimum. We see you there 15 days last month. That means 3 days more than 12. So we're going to give you like extra money for each of those days. That actually had a big effect. It reduced teacher absenteeism from 40% to 20%. But the other ones didn't work so well. Okay, school-based management, again, that was very popular. Most of the estimates are insignificant, but there are a couple cases where they were significant. Teacher performance pay, this is where you pay teachers if they do well. There's 4 studies. Most of them found that it worked. The one that didn't find it was the one I did in Kenya. That one didn't have much of an effect. But in India, Kartik Muralidharan has done it, and I think there's another study too that it works, my co-author Kartik. Okay. Contract teachers, this is actually quite controversial. I don't know if they have this in Peru or not. This is the idea that in countries, especially in Africa and South Asia, where they hired, where they they built more schools and had a lot more kids come to school. So and contract teachers is basically, they hired people who were not necessarily trained teachers. They paid them less. They call them contract teachers because every year they have to renew their contract. They don't have any guaranteed employment or anything like that. They can be let go anytime, any year. So that might sound terrible if you're a teacher, but actually that has a huge incentive for these people to work hard, because if they don't work hard, they're not going to be there next year. So the 2 studies, there are only 2. I think one was in Kenya and one was in India again. The kids learned a lot more from these contract teachers, okay? And then finally, private school vouchers, 5 studies, 2 of them found significant effects in test scores, but 3 of them did not. So it sometimes seems to work, it doesn't. Okay, so those are, I've shown you a lot of numbers, probably more than you'll ever remember, but if you want the papers coming out, and I can send Juan a copy and people can take a look at this. I actually didn't put all the numbers. There are other ones in there, like I just showed mostly the ones where you have more than one study. So let me kind of summarize in the next one. In terms of getting kids into school, there were 3 things that seemed to work. Conditional cash transfers, although they're kind of expensive, actually they can be very expensive. merit-based scholarships, the thing about merit-based scholarships is they're very different. I mean, let me give you an example. There's a very nice study by Musa Blimpo in Benin, an African country, where he had 3 different things. One is that, okay, we just tell these kids, okay, this year, by the end of the year, if you get a score above this amount on this test we're going to give you, we're going to pay for the next 2 or 3 years of schooling. Another one, they said, okay, there's like 30 of you kids in here. We're going to give the top 10 kids, more if they do this. And then the third one was something like they grouped kids in groups of 4, and they said, okay, if your group is one of the top groups, then you're going to get, money for schooling later on. So, they all actually worked in that case. They all worked kind of similar. They all had significant positive effects. But there's more than one way to do it, okay, and the costs of them differ. And then the last thing that actually gets kids in school is building new schools, okay? But those were in places that have very remote areas, Afghanistan, Burkina Faso. But as I understand it, there are places in Peru that also are pretty remote. So maybe relevant for Peru. Okay, in terms of getting kids to learn more, we actually have a lot more evidence, a lot of things that seem to work. Conditional cash transfers seem to work in some cases, although they're expensive. Merit-based scholarships work, building new schools, having a longer school day, reducing the teacher-pupil ratio, but again, that's expensive. School meals, again, that's expensive. Teaching at the right level, that actually could be very inexpensive. You just sort of say, okay, don't use that textbook if the kids can't read it, just find out where the kids are and take it from there. Tracking or streaming, but only one study of that one. Computers and internet and, access to the internet and stuff like that. A lot of the time, more than half the time, they seem to work well in terms of learning, but if they're not done right, it can make things worse. School-based management, of the 7 studies, 3 of them found significant effects, but if you look at the number of estimates, there were 21 estimates from the 7 studies. Only 3 out of 21 significant, so maybe not such a great idea. Teacher performance pay worked in 2 of the 3 countries, India and Chile. Contract teachers worked in India and Kenya. And then vouchers for private schools worked in 2 out of the 5 countries. Okay, so we seem to have a lot of things that work here. And one thing that we would have liked to do in this chapter, we hadn't run out of time to write it, was to compare the costs of these things, okay? Because some of them, like tracking and streaming, is almost like no cost at all to that. But other things like conditional cash transfers and school meals, they can be very expensive, okay? I think this is the last. Okay, but now also some caveats that you have to be careful about this. First of all, some things worked in some countries but not in others. Why did that happen? Okay, that's sort of the heterogeneity. Actually, let me go to the first point. Also, some didn't work, maybe not because there was something inherently wrong, but because it wasn't implemented correctly. And the textbooks studies from Kenya and Sierra Leone may be good examples of that. And if something works well in one country, we're not sure it works well in another country. Or if it doesn't work well in a country, that doesn't mean it's not going to work in any country. Maybe it'll work more in a different country. Okay, so there's a lot more we need to learn, just sort of summing up. So when a policy doesn't work, I mean, one way to look at a lot of the results we had was it was kind of disappointing. A lot of things didn't work. So it was like a waste of money or something. On the other hand, you can say, well, we actually learned something. When we find out that something doesn't work, it's important to know that, okay? So why doesn't it work? Well, it could be implemented poorly, like getting the wrong textbooks or something like this. It could be that when you do something, substitute away, and the example of that is from a study in Pakistan where they gave kids these, I think it was like, they gave the school a lot of money, and the parents had already bought all their school supplies, and then learning went up. But then the next year, the parents knew it was going to happen again. It turned out the next year, parents didn't buy so many school supplies, and so that was sort of substituting away. And then the next year, it had no effect. It may be that there's something else that's really the big problem. It's the binding constraint, and you're really not addressing that big problem. Or and this is something where there's very little evidence, but some new interesting studies, where maybe you need to have 2 things happen at the same time, then it will work. Like maybe you need trained teachers and computers. If you have one or the other, it's not going to work. Finally, something could not work because it really is not ever going to work. And we think that governance issues are kind of where there's a lot of potential here, but also a lot of controversy. They may be where we're going to have the biggest sort of potential gains in terms of learning in developing countries. Okay, well that's it. I've gave you a lot of information there, so I'm happy to take any questions. I have to tell you that sometimes I don't remember all the numbers, what country they came from and so forth, because we had 120 papers that we looked at, but hopefully I can remember some of them. So I'm happy to take any questions from anyone. Just raise your hand or, yeah.
Two quick questions. One is how much publication bias may lead your results to be over-optimistic? And the second, a bit more provocative, but I was puzzled about you showing that at the same level of GDP, high-income countries mostly focus their efforts on primary education. So should we infer that it might be a good policy not to focus too much in getting all the kids to school up to secondary in a context of scarce human capital and scarce and scarce resources, to actually focus on get very good primary education?
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll answer each question as they come up. So publication bias, that's the potential. This is the idea that, if you find something that doesn't work, you can't get your paper published, and so we're just finding the things that work, and there could be lots of other stuff. But what we actually did, in addition to looking at publications, I forgot to say, we also looked at working papers that have been published in the last actually they're not published almost by definition in the last 5 years. So we're including a lot of working papers. But I think it still could be a problem. On the other hand, there is a lot of effort being put forth to try to make sure that things that don't work don't get ignored. Through the American Economic Association, there's this registry of RCTs and maybe other studies too, so that this is what people do in medical science, so that the things that don't work don't get shut away. And then there's this 3IE organization based in, it's like International Institute for Impact Evaluation. They also are, they have a journal where they specifically say, if it didn't work, we'll publish your paper. So I actually published one paper in there on Madagascar, and other people are doing it too. The second thing was sort of, should we focus more on primary schools, get them working? Yeah, I think that could be true. I mean, for, developed countries are doing relatively well. Developing countries, there is sort of this trade-off. Almost every country, every kid's going to primary school, but should we be, there's scarce resources, so they have to make a trade-off between, do we try to get everybody through secondary school, or should we take some of that money and improve primary schools? That's one, I can't really say what's the right, my own personal bias would be, why don't you try to improve what's at primary school for equity considerations, but other people may have different opinions.
Something that it's missing in the presentation, maybe in the papers reading, is not only talk about significance, statistical significance, but also with standard deviation, the size of the effect, no? The other question is that, are you referring, when you talk about management-based school, are you talking about also private organizations? Because there is a trend to use public-private partnerships in order to manage public schools, and there are a couple of studies that are estimating the effect, and they do find very huge effects on test scores, not on time at school, but also in test scores. And the last question, but that you said, is about the mechanisms of this. No, it's not clear to me what are the mechanisms by through the policy is good or bad, and maybe this is there is a space to another research, another publication, another report in order to find out what is working or not in every country in particular.
Yeah, those are good questions. The first one, another criticism of this is that we didn't say how big the effects were. We say it's significant or it's not significant, but something can be significant and very small, okay? I'm working with some other people to produce a report for the Swedish evaluation agency, where we're going to have, for the test scores, we're going to have what you call effect sizes, how many standard deviations. So we're going to put that in there. It's harder to do that for time in school because there's many different variables. There's like attendance rate, there's dropout rate, there's years of schooling. So we decided we couldn't do that. But we'll do that. The second one about school-based management, I think we include studies that are both like public schools only, where it's really not no private engagement. But I think there may also be in their studies where they say, okay, we're going to have these public-private partnerships. I mean, I have to take a look at them, If it's been published, it should be there, or if it's a working paper from these kind of elite working paper series, it should be there. But the details, I can't remember off the top of my head. And finally, the mechanisms, that's a good point, that when something works or doesn't work, what's going on? Okay, for example, and often if you do a very simple RCT, you find out does it work or doesn't work, but you don't know why it worked or why it didn't work, okay? So what we found in the Kenya one, actually what happened with the Kenya textbooks is that the first year, no effect. So we thought, okay, we'll wait another year, still no effect. We actually went for 4 years. In the fourth year, that's when we actually started asking kids, can you read these textbooks? It turned out a lot of them could not read the textbooks. So what you need to do, in addition to just getting their test scores, it's very good to have observations, classroom observation data, focus groups, some qualitative analysis, things like this, to see why something works or doesn't work. So I think, one recommendation that didn't really come out here is that we need to kind of collect a lot more data than just test scores.
In order to determine the average effect for some of the outcomes you analyze, if so, you could quantify the publication bias through that method.
Okay, sorry, what was the method again?
Meta-analysis.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, we didn't, strictly speaking, do a meta-analysis. I mean, part of the reason is that, in the way these are done, these are where you take a bunch of studies and then it's kind of a way of combining, getting a bigger sample size to see like what's the effect. In medical studies, they have, what happens when we try this drug out and they try in different countries. In medical studies, yeah, the drug is kind of, it's the same drug that's been tried in different places. So the sort of, that's a good opportunity to do a meta-analysis. But here, the problem we had is that, each time somebody tried something, it was kind of different. For like these merit-based scholarships, they did it different ways. So we didn't really feel comfortable as just kind of combining them all together and say, yeah, that's the same treatment, let's kind of do that. So while in principle that's something we'd like to do, and especially if we could get a publication bias, we're a little bit worried that the assumptions behind that are not going to really hold because the treatments are different. Yeah.
Hi, I was just curious about this last slide and the reasons that you're saying when a policy doesn't work. You named 5, and I wanted to know more about what is your criteria to describe what is poor implementation, and if it is really an ineffective policy, like how long do we have to wait or try out these other options in order to realize it's really ineffective? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, these are sort of hypotheses that we haven't really checked. We haven't gone back to the studies and say, oh, which of these happened? In fact, many cases it's very hard to do because the appropriate data were not collected. For example, in the second one, if teachers, parents respond to something by changing their behavior, you have to go out and collect that data like, oh, did the parents decide I'm not going to send my kid to a tutor because now the school has improved or something like this. So, and how long do you have to wait? And that's a big deal. I mean, there's this one thing I didn't gloss over is most of these studies, they look for 1 or 2 years to see if there's an effect, and then they say, okay, it didn't work, okay? But you can imagine situations where, oh, it's going to take a long time for this thing to work, so we should wait longer, okay? Part of the reason why they don't wait so long is a lot of these are randomized controlled trials where you have the control group, and you want to keep the control group happy. So you can't say to them, okay, 5 years from now we're going to give you something, okay? But just wait. So no, you have to say, no, 1 or 2 years and you'll get something, and then they're more cooperative. But we don't have we haven't really just thought about how to figure out. We have examples of most of these things, but for most of the studies, we haven't really tried to figure out what was the reason why it didn't work. Okay, so there's a lot more to be done. Yeah, this is not the end by any means.
Thank you, Paul, for the presentation. At the beginning, you were mentioning the case of Vietnam, showing that they were doing very well given their level of income. But on the other hand, I know that there are not many studies, RCTs or small studies done in Vietnam. Is there any way we can link the evidence you have shown with whatever is going on in Vietnam? Because I'm asking this because you have been written some papers about this about Vietnam, so maybe there is some way we can link it.
Yeah. Vietnam, why is it so successful? I'm actually in the process of submitting a research proposal to this RISE thing, which is funded by the British Aid Agency to try to look at that. But I can give you some things. One thing in Vietnam is that the school days, the school year is longer. I think the kids are studying more outside of school, at home. The parents are very big on education. The teacher absenteeism is very low in Vietnam. I think they just, as far as I understand it, there's sort of a teacher union, but it really is run by the government, and so the teachers kind of have to do what they're told. Teachers get a lot of support, I'm told, a lot of coaching and things like this, and teaching is a kind of a high status occupation, where in some countries that's not the case. But the honest answer is we really don't know. These are just kind of possibilities. And then people also pointed out is that, that really high performance of Vietnam was at a level of education that half the kids don't get to. They have a lower secondary school and an upper secondary school. That was mainly in the upper secondary, where you have to take an entrance exam to get into that level. So in some sense, we're missing the bottom 50% in those Vietnam scores. We're probably missing a certain percent in all these countries, but maybe not as high as 50%. But that's something I really would like to know.
Hello, has there been studies about the impact of cash transfers that aren't conditional? Cash transfers?
Cash transfers?
Yeah.
That are not conditional?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually there is one. I didn't show it. There's a study in Malawi where, well, actually there's another kind of related one in Morocco. In Malawi, there's a study where they had different, it was a randomized controlled trial, and some of them, the cash transfers were conditional, and some it was not. And so they didn't work as well when it was not conditional. Okay, you save money. You don't have to check, oh, did the kid attend school in the last month, the number of days required. There was some effect, but it was much smaller than when they're conditional. Okay. On the other hand, Morocco, they did something that's kind of like an unconditional cash transfer. They gave out the money and they said, this is money for education for your kid. But there was no conditionality. They didn't have to spend the money on their education of the kid. They could do whatever they wanted. The kid didn't have to go to school a certain number of days to get the money. They just said, okay, we're giving you this money every month and it's for your kid's education. And that one actually, there were significant effects. So that was one case. We call that, what was it called? It wasn't in the table because there was only one study of it. Sort of like suggestive cash transfers. That wasn't the exact word we called it, but yeah. But so there may be some role for that. But the one case where they were directly compared in Malawi, the conditional cash transfer had a much bigger effect than the non-conditional one. Okay. Any other questions?
Any more questions? Students? No? Okay, so for the sake of lunch, maybe we can
yes.
call it a day and say thanks to Paul with a big round of applause.
Thank you.